I think it's absolutely vital when one considers the contribution in terms of the very survival, in terms of agricultural production, with early colonies, the ability to get currency and any kind of foreign trade from the labor, whether we're talking about rice production, eventually tobacco, and so many other goods that this country produced. Slavery is the complete domination and power over another human being that encompasses all matter of physical and psychological aspects of that human being. As a descendant of Africans who were enslaved in this land, it seems to me there is a particular interest, and as a historian, a commitment to understanding that oppression from the perspective of those who were oppressed. And I think by definition, how a slave understood or understands his or her oppression will be different from how the person who is extracting by force that labor and all the matters of psychological and physical characteristics from that individual. I think that the mere presence of this enormous force of dependent laborers for life creates among those who are free a particular identification and valuing of that freedom that I think individuals who are not constantly around a group of people who are denied all liberties would appreciate. And so I think that it's for that reason why it's so vital to really understand what it meant from that slave's perspective about this. Unlike any other, well, there are several factors, but unlike any other slavery that existed, and we have from the earliest records that slavery, whether Chinese enslaving Chinese, Europeans enslaving Europeans, Africans enslaving Africans, in no place in the world at any time, except in the case of North America, did there evolve, or the New World slavery, did there evolve a system where one's enslavement is intimately connected eventually in the thinking of the enslavers with race? So that what evolves in North America is a belief system where to be black meant to be a slave and to be a slave meant to be black. And that kind of identification has a lasting legacy that I think we still feel and experience today in American society. I think that the key issue in understanding American slavery and the issue of race is that, first and foremost, this concept of race is a creation. It's not something natural. It's not something that either the Europeans coming to this land or the Africans in this earliest period in the 17th century, and even early in the 18th century, has established itself, that you have all kinds of dependent laborers. You have Europeans from various countries who are indentured servants. You have Indians who are also both serving as slaves or various forms of dependent labor. And we know that these various dependent laborers, by the records of individuals who are running away, by the accounts that we have on the diaries and letters of those who controlled their labor, that they're identifying with each other on the basis of that common oppression. And what happens when people face this realization, and it's through a very systematic and conscious effort on the part of the owners of labor to make these divisions, that it's a whole new confrontation, an added dimension of the brutality that they're experiencing. And I would argue that it's a brutality that people of color in this land have continuously had to deal with, because the stark, simple, brutal reality of this culture of racism in American society is simply that one is despised, is oppressed, and is brutalized simply because one is not white. And so the challenge that people faced both during slavery and much later is, as a parent, for example, what do you tell your child? That you're oppressed, you're forced to labor for others, that you can be killed if you disobey, you can be killed or severely beaten because you fail to give the proper deference by this other, this person who has no blood link or any kind of connection with you. And I think that the kinds of ideas that develop from this, and first and foremost, I think, is that whites are this very, very dangerous group. And that the kinds of ideas that allowed for the kind of mutual desertion and identification with each other as a common kind of oppression fades dangerously into the background. I think from the 16th century, where there is this first contact between traders, Europeans on the African coast, and the very beginnings of any kind of trade, slaves are taken largely through kidnappings. Eventually, what evolves within this trade is a gathering of human laborers deeper and deeper into the interior of the continent. And as this happens, for Africans who are learning about this alien people, who seem to have an insatiable desire for black bodies, the belief came about among many that these Europeans were cannibals. And it makes sense. I mean, they would never see the people who are taken away from their communities again. There seems to be just an unrelenting desire and quest for more and more bodies. So for the Africans who first come into the slave coast and are being held, not only are they confronting the reality of perhaps having witnessed family members and loved ones who were killed. I think that the Africans that are marched to the coast have invariably experienced, either among themselves, the deaths, maimings, beatings of family members, and if not of their own blood kin, they invariably have witnessed the kinds of atrocities that are inevitable in any kind of slave system. So there's that trauma that they're experiencing. Once they get to the African coast, with different ethnic groups, some of whom they no doubt had considered enemies, some of whom they had no familiarity with or no ability to communicate with because of different languages, these thoughts, many may have never seen the ocean before. So there's no familiarity of what awaits them. And when we consider also that as we progress into the 17th century, with the ever-increasing demand for the transatlantic slave trade, that there are individuals who, large numbers, believe that the Europeans are cannibals. So in addition to all the other incredible fears and suspicions and apprehensions, this possibility, and they're thinking that they're going to be eaten by these Europeans. Whether we're talking about a slave such as Alana Equiano, who when he sees the meat on the ship, thinks that these are parts of a body. When some slaves see wine drinking on the part of Europeans, the belief that they're drinking blood. So all of these things, and this is before even they're forced into the wretchedness of the holds of slave ships. Well, I think the most important, or what would have been the most shocking aspect, would have been, in addition to be chained, the cramped quarters of ships being packed in such a way that a slave will be between the legs of another slave and chained and having to lie in the feces, the lack of air. As the longer this trip takes, the more suffocating the environment and the disease and the possibility of people who we have to face and acknowledge. There are no doubt people who went mad, and the kind of shrieking, the kind of inability to communicate, decisions having to be made with someone, a complete stranger, someone who possibly had been from an ethnic group that had been an enemy, and this person is suffering as yourself. Does one help? Does one simply try to make it the best that one can alone? And I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of this middle passage, is that we have the beginnings of different ethnic groups who generally would have seen themselves as being very distinct, that are now beginning a process of Africanization, where they're seeing each other and finding means of communicating with each other that create a sense of a people. I mean, the very beginnings of that process is there. We know, for example, as well, the presence of rats, of lice. When you consider that people are manacled as well, the ability to feel different parts of the body would have been very limited. Being forced to eat despicable kinds of food are all things that people would have been experiencing. And not knowing, where am I being taken? What is my fate? For weeks, months, depending what the point of origin was. I think that not only is there a process of Africanization that's going on in the ships, but part and parcel of that process is something that I think scholars have not paid in any adequate attention to, and that is the ideas that these various ethnic groups brought with them about what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a woman. Now, I think that the concepts of what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman is being reevaluated. That in most traditional African societies, as societies everywhere in the world, that their different cultures develop these ideas about manhood and womanhood. Traditionally in these societies, that the kinds of gender roles which are being played, broadly speaking, because each group has their own particular reality, but broadly speaking, men are playing this role militarily, that women collectively in traditional African societies are playing the primary role agriculturally. And in the reality that on slave ships, that if any slaves or any people were allowed on the deck, and obviously therefore the greater ability to observe what these captors are doing and any possible access to weapons, and consequently to negotiate and to try to plan and plot for any kinds of means of revolt, and to regain their freedom, is going to be to provide an opportunity, more so than an opportunity, an essential role for women in terms of this military opportunity or desire and ambition. And so men and women, or any men, and had ideas of what the proper role of women might have been, a process is changing, because we know that in revolts that are taking place, that women often are the individuals who are able to obtain the arms and to assist in any kind of struggle for freedom on these slave ships. And I think that process of reevaluating and changing attitudes that they would have had about the proper role or the idea of their role militarily versus the role of women would have had to be altered. Well, I think that the expected hatred of people who have forced them from their land, and the suspicion and anger and fear of people whom, again, you may expect or believe are going to eat you, and the fact that women on the ship that we have documentation of clearly are being raped by sailors. And so the new dimensions of the brutality and the immorality and evil of these captors are going to be filtering through the slave ship. So I think that kind of desperation, I think that how does one deal with, as well, increasing numbers of deaths? And those who had any mental trauma at the beginning of the journey, weeks into it, are even going to be more distraught. And how long is this journey going to last? I mean, all these questions, this fear of the unknown is simply going to heighten each day, each night, each week, each month of this journey. I think that if we can imagine the kinds of thoughts of people who are in this unbelievably horrific physical situation, that what would people rely on? And I think that the ideas that people had about their God, about their ancestors, increasingly questions that they may very well have been posing to themselves, eventually, what have I done? Was there some crime? Was there some deed that could have been responsible for me being in this unbelievably barbaric and savage kind of environment? Some did conclude that whatever the reasons for this, it was not worth going on, and hence people starving themselves to death. If given the opportunity to have any kind of mobility of jumping overboard, drowning themselves. And for others, we can never really know. I think it's amazing that people were able to somehow hold on. And maybe this is just this natural situation of this quest for survival. I think it's very hard, or it would be very hard for people, however desperate a situation, to make that decision to take one's life. This is an extraordinary thing for someone to make a decision to do, to come to the mindset that it would be better to die than to continue on in this way. And then once deciding it's better to die, to then take action to do that, whether through starvation or jumping overboard or maiming oneself or whatever to bring oneself to an end. I think that trying to understand the conditions and circumstances on this slave ship and trying to understand the people who have captured you, observing how they treat each other, how these Europeans, these strange-looking people, as those who've recorded their experience about their first encounters with Europeans, when they see the kind of brutality that these Europeans are inflicting upon each other, or the captains of the ship or the people in authority, would have made people, I think, even more terrified, because the sense of people of a particular group that would perhaps be engaging in such brutality to each other. Again, I think back to the narrative of Alana Equiano, who talks about seeing the flogging of sailors, and he expresses even greater awe and terror that these people are so brutal to each other. So I think all of these factors are playing a role in, again, trying to understand what does it mean about where I am and who these people are and what they're going to do to me. Well, I think that in early Virginia, this new land, this trying to understand, again, still what their fate will be in this new system, they are going to be encountering a greater fluidity of possibilities within that early colony. We know, for example, or we know and we don't know exactly what the status is of many of these individuals, but there is evidence from early musters of the Virginia population that whereas European indentured servants are on the list given marital status of Mrs. whoever, in the case of Africans, there are no surnames, there's no marital status, and there are no dates there. And what the dates meant and why they're so important is that if one were an indentured servant, the date of arrival is absolutely crucial because that begins the calendar or the clock ticking, we might say, of how long one's going to have the status of being an indentured or a dependent laborer. The fact that we don't have this on these early accounts of the population for Africans suggests that already there is a distinction between these two different types of dependent labor. We also know that for some Africans, some blacks within the society, that they do obtain by the end of the first quarter of the 17th century free status. And I'm thinking particularly of Anthony Johnson in the Eastern Shore, who I think the only opportunity that a slave is going to be most concerned about during his or her enslavement is how to gain freedom. And I think that for those observing in this society are going to pay close attention to what are the possibilities once free for survival, whether that is in farming, and of course, therefore, in this early colonial society, the importance of acquiring land is vital. And for these earliest blacks in the colony of Virginia, that there were opportunities, clearly, and we have records of people having acquired land. And so the hope of being able to gain freedom, and once in that freedom, to survive and to prosper would have been a major concern. And if one has a family, the kinds of very human desires that people over time throughout all cultures, and an interest in the well-being and the future of these children. And again, within the colonial context, the acquisition of land and the ability to farm and market goods from that land are going to be very important. And I think it's important to note again that the consciousness of race and whiteness and has not taken root in this society yet to the kind of rigidity that eventually evolves. And so there are cases where individuals who do have land and blacks who've gained freedom to see their acquisition of dependent laborers as well to help work that land. No matter what one's status or position in a society, you cannot ignore what the prevailing economic, social, and cultural mores and traditions are. And for many of these, or some of these blacks, and they're very limited records, so it's hard to say definitively. But we do know that there are people who decide for mobility in this society, then the acquisition of laborers, whether indentured or slave, to work this land was something that some of these earliest black arrivals considered. I think that in South Carolina, as in your other colonies, that there is this constant infusion of Africans, and that with each new group, means had to be made, or rather, those Africans who had been here and a growing Creole population of people who were actually born in the New World, or in South Carolina in particular, are making decisions about how best to survive this very brutal system of enslavement. And that slave owners, in a very shrewd manner, are observant and perceptive enough to note the role that Africans who had been here in the Creole population, the concern that they demonstrated for these new people coming into this system, that they would place new Africans into Creole families. And there apparently was a certain pride among many of these Creole populations, or second generation, first generation African Americans, to have these Africans among them. And I think that there is this, throughout the period of slavery in North America, a process of Africanization and African Americanization that are taking place parallel to each other. I think that the survival of Africans on the Middle Passage, that we know that there are processes that begin in which those slaves on the same ship, if they are placed with each other on plantations or on farms in the New World, have created new rules of incest, that the process by which people believed that they were first from being Igbos or Ashanti or whatever ethnic group into being Africans. Not only does that take place on a slave ship, but sometimes on the same journey, that the sense of each one of those individuals as being not only Africans, but brothers and sisters. And that sense of family and that link with each other of such a depth and personal level that these individuals, in cases that we have accounts of, refuse to have any sexual and marital relations with each other because they saw each other from their experience on the slave ship as now being linked in a familial kind of way. So deep that there are rules of incest, that it becomes incestuous in their thinking to have any kind of relations with each other. I think in colonial South Carolina that these earliest communities, that one of the central themes that generation after generation is instilling in each other is this quest for freedom, this sense that regardless of what the external reality of being enslaved is, that one day we will be free, and that there is a legitimizing and admiration for individuals who do make that leap, however costly it is. And after, whether we're talking about the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739 or any of these other quests for freedom, the repercussions afterwards are devastating. And I think it's significant that despite that devastation, that within the oral history, there's enough positive and admiring preservation of ideas about these individuals that they lay a foundation, generation after generation, for other strikes toward freedom. I think that for West Africans who are in colonial South Carolina, regardless of where one is enslaved, the brutality and the horror of that dependence is central and pivotal. But I think in those environments physically that are more similar to the environments from which they came are just one aspect to make that adjustment less challenging and problematic. We know, for example, in these communities early on, the familiarity of various plants and the similarity of plants enable these earliest of Africans and their descendants to devise means for curing various illnesses, or the belief that these would handle and help one in various sicknesses. So that there are these similarities that we know, for example, that many of the Africans coming to colonial South Carolina have a familiarity with rice production. In fact, it's that familiarity that inspires colonial South Carolinian slaveholders to request specifically Africans from these regions, because that familiarity and concept of epidemiological regionalism, whereas the two different populations, the more similar the kinds of disease patterns that they're coming from, the less likely that they will succumb to diseases in the new environment. And because many Africans in the West African coast had had exposure to malaria, better enabled them in the malarial swamps of South Carolina to survive. The myth is, of course, that they were immune, which wasn't the case. They were dying in great numbers. They simply were not dying as rapidly or in as high numbers as Europeans. No matter what the kind of oppression that the earliest Africans are encountering, that there is a interaction and a mutual exchange of ideas. Very often, because I think certain biases and a culture of racism in my thinking that always assumes that any ideas or changes in the thinking of Black people in the earlier time and later had to have come from Europeans, had to come from whites. Whereas in any environment of an interaction with human beings, no idea can be that isolated, much to the chagrin of slave owners, I might add here. And for Africans who, again, for those who are enslaved, their greatest quest is freedom. But people also have to deal with, if they are successful in fulfilling and realizing their greatest ambition, how are they going to survive afterwards? And I think if we look again, using the example of someone like Olana Equiano, that he sees merchant, acting as a merchant and acquiring a skill. I mean, he sees barbering as one of these opportunities. And I think that other Africans as well, what's the going game in colonial South Carolina or colonial Virginia or wherever? How are the people who are most successful securing that success? And can I, as a newly freed Black man or Black woman, what are the possibilities for me in realizing or achieving that same kind of success? And early on, there are seemingly a lot of opportunities, but with the establishment of a racial slavery, these Blacks are their opportunities are increasingly limited. I think with each incoming group of Africans would have perhaps, I think more than perhaps, would have invariably reminded the Africans who had been here, however long that they had been here, reminding them of the kinds of values and opportunities, particularly the issue of a certain liberty on the African continent. And I wonder, and again because we can't know definitively, at what point do Africans begin to think that there's no hope of ever returning to Africa? And I think if what records of slaves who were born here and oral traditions going much after the colonial period, that there's still Africans who this thought of maybe somehow getting back. And I think what's important to try to capture, to try to understand, or at least imagine, is what was the process by which they concluded we'll never get back to Africa. And once that decision is made, then how best should we maneuver or think about it? Because it's a radically different issue. I mean, if one's aim is to find a way to get back to the continent versus we're here, we will always be here, our children will be here, what are the possibilities for us to survive in this particular society at this time? I think that on the Middle Passage and the beginnings of a process that explains the presence of African Americans in society today. And this choice and this decision of a desire both to survive and to be free. Some people decided that if there was no means of obtaining that freedom, it would be better to die. And others, the majority clearly, decided that whatever means it took to survive, that they would make that effort to do so. And I think that for, particularly for descendants of those earliest Africans, as myself, that a great deal of admiration should be there, because these were, and again, I have to emphasize, complete lack of knowledge of what awaited them. It's simply the faith in a desire to live. Because really there was no way of knowing exactly what that life would be like, how long it would last, but nevertheless there is that struggle. And I think that the earliest kinds of means of communicating with each other no doubt would have entailed discussions or trying to communicate what does this future hold for us. And should we try to, is there any point in trying to escape or to rebel? Different religious beliefs, I think, would have no doubt been exchanged or some kind of communication to make sense of this madness. And a madness that's reinforced by the reality of people literally going mad because of it. So the kinds of ideas that would have been contemplated deserve, I think, our respect, if not our reverence for those efforts. I think that the concept of freedom and the reality of slavery present two very distinct intellectual histories. For Africans who are enslaved, their understanding of freedom is radically different from the idea of freedom held by the people holding other human beings as their absolute property. And every opportunity that Africans had from the very beginning to force the best definition, the most humane definition of freedom these Africans took. For Europeans who begin to articulate their sense of freedom by the kinds of laws from the earliest laws that we have, that essential aspect of that freedom is the right to hold property, whether it is in human beings and flesh and blood or a piece of land. The sanctity of property in this society is such a central and ignored, I might add, aspect of freedom. But for Africans, there was a moral issue from the very beginning about what freedom meant, that the ownership within this new land and the kind of evolving ideas that they had, the enslavement of other human beings or the right in that kind of property was immoral. And this conflict between these two people that is eventually the black concept of freedom and the concept that evolves from a people enslaved and the concept of freedom by people who own slaves eventually come together in this glorified view of American democracy. But the hypocrisy and the lie that this was always the case, I think, distorts enormously the earliest grounding and foundation of this nation. I think that one of the challenges of trying to understand the institution of slavery is balancing this issue of the big picture of this horrific institution of oppression with the reality that despite that oppression and subjection, the subjugation of this people, that there are still parents, there are still people who fall in love, who have arguments, have love affairs, have battles and pettiness and jealousies, and the particular beauty that any parent has of bringing forth a new life that's the result of a union between two people. As a slave, however, there's the very mixed feeling that the greatest desire of any slave is to gain freedom, to bring another person in this world from a slave's view and perspective. You're producing a child, something that's your own offspring, but also additional property owned by someone else, that someone else is going to have the power of life and death. For a father or a mother who produces a daughter, there's even another dynamic, that not only is this child going to be the subject of a coerced labor with no payment, but also is going to be particularly targeted for sex. And that we know that, and again in accounts from the words of slaves, mothers talking about this fear and knowing that it was an inevitable prospect, because every rape not only could fulfill the sexual gratification of the rapist, but as a slave owner, if there was any child produced from this sexual violence and exploitation, more money in the bank. Because in that flesh and blood, in any kind of financial crisis, or any kind of frivolous desire for just, a Thomas Jefferson who had an insatiable desire for every kind of good, whether it was wine, books, furniture, in a hard time to keep Monticello up with all of its glory, was the disposal of slave property. I think when we talk about family, it's important for us to remember that these ideas of kinship are coming from Africa. That generation after generation, in this new, horrifying place that they've been forced to come, cutting across different ethnic groups within Africa, one factor that is central in all of these societies is the importance of kinship. In the slave society in the New World, those ideas of this extended network of family with so many kinds of mutual obligations that a broad range of Africans and their descendants had very clear-cut ideas about this. And in the slave society, with this constant threat, not only threat, but the reality of being torn from loved ones, meant that they're constantly coming into that slave community people who are psychologically traumatized, could have been sold from their husband, from their wife, separated from their parents. And what this created was a particular value placed on those ties of kinship and a cherishing of the moments, and I use that word very deliberately, because within a slave society you had no way of knowing how long you might be able to spend. And so we have these accounts of people after laboring in fields, whether rice plantations or tobacco fields, from sunup to sundown, who are then traveling miles at night to visit relatives, loved ones who were sold off to another plantation. And I think that in trying to understand what these slaves accomplished, it could have just as easily been the case for people to say, I might be sold away. Why should I even attach myself to love someone? I mean, the reality, if you think about it, why love somebody if you know that you have no power over how long you might be able to be with that individual? And so the fact that no matter where we're talking about, whether it's colonial New York or colonial Virginia, that this emphasis on the family and this effort to keep together is something that should create this enormous admiration on our part today, looking back. I think that in an examination of slavery and the creation of community and a black worldview, is that there is this constant process in North America of Africanization and African Americanization. And because of this complete disregard for the familial relations among slaves, that you have black men and women being sold constantly in different parts of the colonies. And you have this constant importation of new Africans. And the kind of communication was vital, because the very survival of each slave was predicated on the clarity among other slaves, whether they were recently purchased or a third generation American, or someone who had been recently sold from the Caribbean. And so that the ideas and I think enormous value was placed on those slaves who had the greatest access to the oppressor. And so despite the myths about house servant and field slave divisions, the reality is that it is through the house servants that information about the nature of the owner, the financial position of the owner, and that of course became vital, because if the finances of that owner, whether a George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or less respected figures, figures in American history were suffering any kind of financial crisis, so much of the capital that they had or what they could exchange was human beings. And so by learning of that condition could bring forth discussions of possibly running away. Or is there something that we can do to get an intercession that get the ear of the owner to make a particular plea, a personal plea, not to sell myself or the children or the wife or the husband. When we talk about this model and this image of slavery as a patriarchal society, I mean, there are slaveholders who promote this. I mean, this idea just didn't drop out of the sky. And there are clearly, if we look at the diaries and the letters of many slaveholders, I think they're a minority, but for many of them believe very sincerely, did look at their slaves as part of their family and did have this enormous affection for certain slaves. But I think what's most important is what was the thinking and the perspective of those slaves? I think that the important thing to consider in the master-slave relationship is that it can be very confusing, or certainly it can easily distort a reality that one could have great affection. Talking about human beings, the humor, the acts of kindness that we know slaves had for particular owners, and we know that particular owners had for groups of slaves. What's most important, however, is the big picture. Did ever any of those acts or instances of kindness change the thinking of a slave to make him or her accept their collective bondage and enslavement? And having gone through exhaustive records, this wasn't the case. That the issue of ownership, the issue of being able to buy and sell, to dispose of at one's will, for whatever reason, to compel someone to labor with no financial reward, having to look at these magnificent mansions growing up all over and being built wherever there was slavery, and the increasing enrichment of individuals with no benefit to oneself was something that could not alter any act of kindness for individuals. I think that a particularly important reality of slavery that we should always remember, never forget, is that the institution of slavery is both a system of economic mobility and eventually a system of racial oppression. No matter how much one had land in this colonial period and early national period, a key factor is how does one get from that land whatever richness or riches that are within it. And in a slaveholding society, the means of the most effective means and the most lucrative means of getting the full benefit of that land was through slavery. And so the ambition of a white majority was a social mobility and ambition to one day own slaves themselves. And the ideas about blacks and about slaves as this culture of racism develops created a greater and greater insensitivity about the wrongness and immorality of that exploitation. I think that the institution of slavery bred, first and foremost, a constant consideration of danger and potential danger. It was a system in which one was always faced with the potential of life and death for could be anything or everything. And consequently, one could not make assumptions about the honesty or the faithfulness of fellow slaves. As we progress during the slave era, the possibility of manumission, and when we keep in mind that the greatest ambition of slaves was to be free, it became increasingly necessary to gain freedom by some great act of good service. And there's no better service from the slaveholder's perspective than betraying other slaves. And so that one had to be cautious. I think that there was this small number of people who were collaborators, but how many does it take? So if 200 people on a plantation or 10 people on a farm, all it took was one person to betray. And so the mask that any slave had to wear was one that cut in a lot of different directions. I mean, if you wear a mask long enough and you're not getting the reinforcement from your significant others that, this is a collective front that we're putting forth, you can begin to believe those ideas and those images that you're putting forth. And then when we consider also that in this early, in the time period of the early nation, that before the Civil War, but before the American Revolution, the majority of free blacks were mulattoes. And these mulattoes had developed collectively and generally a sense of mobility through an internalization and an adoption of the prevailing views among their white counterparts. And when I say white counterparts, there are the number of blacks who were slave owners are overwhelmingly mulattoes. And so any illusion about, merely because of one's color, that one can assume that they would be against the institution of slavery or committed to your aspirations to freedom, and however you might achieve that, was false, that you couldn't take that chance. I think the reach of slavery was so pervasive throughout the colonies that it's easy to forget. I mean, because it was so widespread and people took it as such a given that whether you're in colonial New York, for example, or colonial New England, where the lack or the profitability of the institution of slavery meant, for example, that slave babies were an encumbrance. And so in colonial Massachusetts, for example, when babies were weaned, they were given away like puppies. And we have accounts, of course, that what was first and foremost of importance in a slave society were the interest of the slave owner. And if, in fact, the woman was the white slave-holding woman, needed a nurse, and that slave woman had also just had a child, the needs of that black child were dismissed. And this slave woman is nursing this white baby who owned her just as much as the mother, and ultimately, despite being fed on the milk of this black breast, that this infant ultimately would have the power to sell, dispose, to whip, to discard in any way possible. And so the psychological impact of that, the horror of that, is something that every slave had to face. One of the myths in American culture and in the culture of racism, which is part and parcel of colonial America and the new nation, is that all ideas about freedom and all ideas, in fact, of significance are ideas coming from white Americans. And Africans are bringing with them ideas about liberty, ideas about freedom. Their experience as slaves within this nation or this colonial society are further shaping how they felt about freedom. And so slaves, because the owners wanted to have their conveniences, are going to take their slaves off to college, are going to take them on trips, are going to expose them to the most enlightened ideas of the day. And of course, the slaves are not going to have an opportunity to discuss these with their owners, but we can only assume that they are discussing them among other slaves, and there are these dual tracks of freedom. I mean, if we just focus on freedom, that they're going to hear Enlightenment ideas about, we can imagine, say, Thomas Jefferson with his slave with him at William and Mary, or Thomas Jefferson with his slave writing the Declaration of Independence, that from a slave's perspective, the idea of freedom is very different. And what we know about slaves, wherever we're talking about in the 13 colonies or the early nation, is that any and every opportunity to press for what they considered real freedom and the most moral and honest kind of freedom they took. So if they were in an environment where they could make petitions to the legislature to claim their freedom, knowing that the latest idea or ideology floating around their white owners were particular ideas about freedom, to press them. Okay, you're talking, about this particular kind of freedom. Should I not be free? And that forced a rethinking on the part of some patriarchs and some whites, so that it's a two-way avenue, as with any human community. I think it's terrifying to come to the realization that Black people in general, and slaves in particular, had become such common features and sort of part of just a backdrop, that the contradiction of talking about a freedom from the British never prompted in the vast majority of the people talking about this that this was very inappropriate language, because they themselves, as slaves, reminded them, every slave who had an opportunity to reminded them, as did the British, that there was this gross distortion about their complaint of enslavement by the British, when they themselves are holding hundreds of thousands of people in bondage themselves. The language of freedom that your colonial patriots in their struggle against British domination, and the fact that these people who are struggling for their freedom from the British fail to see the contradiction or the relevance of their enslavement of Black people, reflects the deepening of a culture of racism that makes Black people irrelevant. To be Black is to be a slave, and to be a slave is to be Black. And that is their function, that is their role, and it has nothing to do with their quest and their needs and their desires and their quest as whites, as slaveholders, as people struggling for an opportunity to further their property interests and their material ambitions was all that counted. I think that the emergence of an idea of freedom in American society was simply a creation of an idea of a particular inalienable right that only whites should be free, specifically white men with property. That was at the very foundation and inception of this nation. And as long as we fail to address it, recognize it, deal with it, the perpetuation of this lie about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence will continue. The history of blacks militarily in this country goes on long before the American Revolution, but at the time of the American Revolution, several things are happening, that there are free blacks and that there are enslaved blacks whose idea of freedom and liberty makes them feel some identification with some of these white Americans. They also recognize that whether British or American, that whatever these whites' definition of freedom is, somehow they're not included in it. And what they're negotiating or what they decide to do is whoever is going to most realize their understanding of freedom will have their loyalty. And at the time of George Washington's acceptance of the contribution of blacks who were fighting in the earliest battles in the American Revolution, once he realizes the danger for slave property and the implications for the institution of slavery, argues fiercely that these blacks can no longer be fighting in the Continental Army. It is only when another group of whites put forth an interpretation of freedom more in line with the interpretation of blacks, i.e., regardless of color and regardless of race, the inalienable right is that we should all be free. When the British seem to present that perspective, they joined the British side. I think that what the military role of blacks is in the American Revolution reflects how central the institution of slavery is to this nation. The central role of slavery in the very foundation and the founding of this nation is revealed in the fact that both the British and your American patriots find the military role of slaves crucial in the success on either side, and both attempt to use blacks for their own end, whereas the continuing ambition of slaves to gain freedom and their understanding of the system is also reflected. We know how important and how central slavery is in British mainland North America and the early United States, its very inception, by the fact that during the war that established this nation, both your American patriots and the British, who were attempting to keep their colony in place, recognized very early on that slaves could play a pivotal, if not essential role in whichever way that struggle went. And of course, as we know, before any American Revolution or even discussion of it, slaves were waging their own revolution and their own ambition for freedom by taking whatever opportunity came forward, any conflict that possibly would position them to gain their freedom. And the British demonstrated earliest that, and perhaps that's why approximately 20,000 slaves and joined them and in this battle, to suggest that they would be able to gain their freedom best from the British than your Americans. I think if we look at the life of Venture Smith, we're forced to recognize, or we're invited to recognize and to at least address and imagine the different aspects and dynamics of the institution of slavery. Again, over and over again, we have to see, or slaves and their actions and those who have left any record force us to see that there's nothing more important to them than the securing of their freedom. At the same time, people are falling in love, falling out of love, becoming parents, reaching a point of caring for older relatives, and all the kinds of human dynamics and choices, despite the fact that they're oppressed, despite the fact that they're enslaved. And we can never say exactly what Venture Smith was thinking at the time, but we know by his action that he opted, or he made a strike for his own freedom, despite the fact that his wife was about to have a child. And how people change, or whatever the dynamics are, we know that this very same person labors for over 2 decades to buy his children, to buy his wife, and perhaps it's simply an issue of youth. Just that simple, of an unwillingness or a belief that that by striking out at this point, he can secure something that he would, if he didn't do it right then, he possibly would never ever have an opportunity to achieve. He could possibly have been thinking it was far more likely for a man to be separated from his children and his wife than a woman from her husband and her children. People can always find various rationales if they think long and hard enough, and may have considered that this opportunity for freedom outweighed any kind of commitment or responsibility. And he possibly may have, the kinds of idealism and of young people may have thought in seeking his freedom and possible wealth in Mississippi, that's where he's aiming, the Mississippi River, that he'd be able to buy them. We don't know, but I think what's most revealing, however, is that he eventually makes this Herculean, unbelievable effort and succeeds in purchasing his family. I think that it reminds us that Venture's purchase of 2 black men reveals again that the institution of slavery is one of economic mobility, as well as it is, on whites at least, on white slaveholders at least, a means of racial oppression. Venture is very ambitious and very desirous of being able to purchase his family. And so here's one of the ironies. He's secured enough money to buy land, but how does he work that land? Does he have money to hire workers, or does he have money that to secure the long-term financial success that he needs to purchase his family? Does he have to, or does he perceive or conclude that the only way to do this is through a labor that he has complete command over? One aspect of American society and the relationship of slavery to American society is intimately connected with the issue of property, which is a vital aspect, the essential aspect of any capitalist society. And in the same way that the transatlantic slave trade is part and parcel of the rise of capitalism in the 15th century, so too is American society's involvement with slavery on this land, in this land, tied to another dimension and furthering of that same capitalistic economic system, where property and capital is sacred. And within the Constitution, and allusions to, or rather explicit kinds of references, without stating slave or slavery explicitly, makes it clear that the property rights in human beings will be cherished and valued as well. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and another variant of that not long after makes it clear that property, whether in human beings, black babies, black children, black adults, black flesh, period, was going to be sacred and as vital and valuable to this system than as any other kind of property or capital. The fact that indentured servitude becomes less and less important in this society and slavery becomes more and more important further reflects the development of this culture of racism, that its first proclamation, we might argue, is that this was to be a nation of and for white people, and specifically white males at that time. And that reality at the very beginning of this nation is such that if we don't acknowledge it and explore it and recognize it, that it's tied as much to concepts of race as to concepts of property, and that the pursuit of happiness, using the words of the revered Thomas Jefferson, meant the accumulation of wealth at whoever's expense, and in this case, the expense of blacks who are enslaved. I think Mount Vernon and other major properties of founding fathers and other important members of American society during the slave era personify a historical amnesia. And that is, on the one hand, when we visit those places and establishments today, how they're presented generally is to downplay, if not completely ignore, how the wealth of a Washington or Jefferson or any of these great Virginia gentlemen was predicated on the enslavement, exploitation, and gross oppression of African and African Americans. If you consider with any of these large mansions and plantation manor homes in the colonial early national period, the amount of labor that it took just to supply these homes with water for a day demanded hours and hours of several slaves going back and forth to rivers and carrying this water. And so on the one hand, we can talk, and we're certainly encouraged to talk about their architectural beauty and the importance of the individuals who live in them. And we're encouraged to forget or to ignore that that beauty and that grandeur was dependent on the enslavement of human beings, people who were denied for their entire lives any hope of liberty or mobility or opportunity for their children, whereas the descendants of these people who engaged in the immoral act of slavery were able to enrich not only themselves, their children, their descendants, but to lay claim to a nation that was founded on the backs of captive Africans. Absolutely. The human misery then, and I think there's a misery today. I mean, when I look at these, I feel a certain pain and outrage that it's ignored that the people that kept these plantations working, these people who enabled a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson to amass, huge libraries, fine wines, beautiful furniture, exquisite sets of silver. For me to look at them, I cannot forget or I cannot ignore the human misery that these individuals extracted from their laborers, the people whom they owned. During the colonial period with slave parents, and when we consider that these parents would have been producing oftentimes the very first generation of blacks who were born on North American soil, it was a time period where the hope and the dream of being able to realize freedom, if not for themselves, for their children, would have been much more likely than later in this country during the period of slavery. But at whatever point a slave parent had a child, the issue of how to protect that child's psyche, that child's belief or understanding of his or her own dignity and value as a human being is inherently compromised by the ownership of someone else, by someone who, despite your parenting this child, could take that child from you, could beat you, could rape, and in all manner of abuse. The longer one waited to expose that child to the danger from that oppressor, and as this culture of racism sets in, where the commonality between dependent laborers of different races recedes, that is not only having to instruct children about the danger of one's owner, but the danger of any white person. And we don't have adequate records to say definitively at what point that it did, but I think very often what would have happened in the process of waiting and thinking about when best to tell a child what it meant to be a slave, something happened. A child who always saw a parent in a particular way, in a nurturing way, in a respectful way, perhaps is witnessing that parent being whipped, or the kind of pride or dignity or respect that one's receiving in the environment where it's all slaves changes radically when that child for the first time sees his or her mother or father in the presence of a white. I think in the establishment of what I would call a black worldview, a body of beliefs and values that these Africans evolve with each succeeding generation born on this soil, created as a central tenet and an important idea among them the need to resist, the need to always strive ultimately for a collective freedom. And how they did this, whereas obviously most people were unwilling to risk death, that nevertheless there were nonviolent or safer means of showing this hostility and this disdain for this system which slaves considered immoral and wrong, no matter when, where, or how, that it was a wrong, immoral, iniquitous system. And whether people manifested or demonstrated their hostility or their commitment to that collective view about the institution of slavery, whether that was through mocking the master, arson, the destruction of tools, the decision to run off with the British and fight with the British to prevent these American slaveholders who were talking about a freedom that seemed very alien to the kind of freedom that the Africans and their descendants believed in. Any act of protest against the institution of slavery could possibly result in one's death. And if we consider and recognize that in the thinking of slaves, there were these dual quests and ambitions, both to survive and to be free, and that there was a support and an encouragement for many of these slaves, most of these slaves, however they demonstrated, whether that was to celebrate a slave who did protest in a way that resulted in the loss of his or her death, or the support of a runaway, or the failure to betray or to say who had appropriated some property that the person who did no labor to produce claimed as his or her own. And all of those things were part of this mindset, this collective black worldview that had as an essential component some demonstration, an effort to show the wrongness and immorality of the institution of slavery. Issues of morality and right and wrong are issues that Americans pride themselves on instilling in each generation of Americans. But somehow the immorality of slavery is not given the same kind of encouragement and desire, so that oftentimes when we talk about slavery or attempt to talk about slavery, we're dismissed as reading back into an earlier time our sensitivities today. Well, there were people back in this earlier time, the majority of black people, for example, who certainly saw the institution of slavery as immoral. And I personally, as an African American, take it as an insult for someone to say, well, everyone back then had slaves. Well, everyone didn't have slaves. And there were people, a very small number of whites, who saw the institution of slavery as immoral, and a majority, overwhelming majority of blacks. Do we discount what African Americans and Africans felt about the institution of slavery? It seems in how the history of this country has been written that we can assume that perhaps there are large numbers of people in this country who do feel that it's irrelevant what that majority felt at the time. I think how blacks, whether during the colonial period or the early national period or the antebellum period, felt about freedom didn't change. I think what changed was a confidence and faith and hope about achieving it. I think if we try to imagine the kind of hope and perhaps even almost a giddiness during the American Revolution and the aftermath, where thousands of blacks who fought in the American Revolution and were fighting with the hope that they would gain their freedom, and the establishment of some gradual emancipation acts would have made so many of these blacks, former slaves, and those who still had relatives enslaved, think that maybe something will come of this nation. Maybe despite the stories and the traditions of that nightmare of the Middle Passage will pass, that there will be freedom. I think that during the American Revolution, for example, the quest for freedom and the decision of blacks to fight in that battle who were slaves very much is tied to, or it is tied to their ambition and hope that they could gain their freedom. But I think the thinking of blacks in this country has always been far more complex and challenging on every issue than what free people and white people have believed. Because whereas the blacks fighting the American Revolution could have very much been opposed to the kind of oppression of the British, but they also knew that their freedom and how they felt about freedom, that nobody, regardless of their race or religion, should be enslaved, was not something shared either by British whites or American whites. I think that in American society, and specifically during the American Revolution, the kinds of ideas that Africans who were fighting in that battle had about freedom were different from either British whites or American whites. But this wasn't to say that they did not in part share both groups' ideas and concepts of freedom. I think that the internal communication lines for blacks very early on became absolutely crucial and vital. That the only way to be able to decide the sort of life and death issue of one, risking to fight with either group was very much dependent on who did these slaves feel could best assure their gaining their freedom. There's a long tradition in this country for the oppressed and the enslaved to have to know their oppressors and to know at what time would they have the greatest chance of achieving their most important ambition, and that ambition being one of freedom. And whenever the colonizers or their enslavers had conflicts or wars, whether with Native Americans or other Europeans, there certainly was a tradition that these were good opportunities and times to maneuver their freedom. And so with the beginnings of arguments about the acquisition of freedom from the patriot's position, I'm sure there were many discussions within that slave community about what does this mean? Is this going to open up a door of opportunity for us to gain our freedom? And from that point, and there would of course have been very receptive ears to any of those discussions, from that point, which group? Neither the British nor the Americans had a conception of freedom that were shared by the majority of slaves. The majority of slaves looked upon the institution of slavery as this immoral act and wrong, no matter who was holding the whip. So that part of their decision had to be, once again, a lesser of two evils, but whichever evil best assured their permanent freedom would have been the decision that they made. While the hope of freedom is the prevailing and central thought of slaves as a group, this quest, this ambition, and certainly any actions to try to realize it could cost them their lives. And so for generations of slaves, it became imperative that that wish, that ambition was hidden in some way. And the way they hid this was in a multiplicity of ways, showing contentment, because no one could, one's chances of making some strike for freedom, either by running away or whatever act or whatever mechanism by which they hoped to do so, The only advantage they could have by being outarmed and outnumbered would be the element of surprise. And so by keeping this visual appearance of being content or happy with their bondage was a weapon that they had. And it was obviously an incredibly important and successful weapon, since we know as time progressed, generally speaking, whites felt a certain security in their safety. Think in this earliest point in the founding of this nation, the hope that the great quest of African people and the enslaved for freedom, the great hope and ambition of those, that minority of blacks who had gained their freedom, and the prospect that perhaps these ideas about inalienable rights will be broadened to capture the kind of inalienable truth about freedom that blacks believed in, that never was held or shared by the majority of whites who were talking about this idea. There would have been this hope that perhaps these two views would come together. And there was evidence that there was this possibility. The fact that beginning in Pennsylvania, gradual emancipation laws were enacted gave hope. The fact that thousands of blacks who had fought in the American Revolution gained their freedom gave hope. But at the same time, there were indications that would have been very unsettling. From the outset, for example, the fact that those individuals most identified with these ideas, specifically Thomas Jefferson, was himself a slaveholder, forced anyone who had this hope that there would be freedom for all, was compromised. And also the fact for those blacks in the North who were free, or the number, though there was still, of course, widespread slavery in the North, but for those individuals who were hoping that these gradual emancipation acts would eventually free them in the North, would have been observing, if not experiencing themselves, a horrible truth, and that is a number of white slaveholders in the North, to prevent the economic loss from any Emancipation Act, were selling slaves. So we have between 1790 and 1830 a decrease of over 700 blacks in Rhode Island. And that throughout the North, either the black population remains stagnant or there's a decrease. And there's really no way to explain this other than the fact that these individuals are being sold. And so where are the ideas, what took precedence among these early Americans, these early white Americans? And again, I think that the key issue that we have to always remember is that nothing was more sacred in this early nation than the sanctity of property, whether that property was in human flesh or in a piece of real estate. I think with the issue of progress in this country, technology and technological innovations have always been terribly important, valued, esteemed. Many American heroes are those individuals who have come up with technological innovations. But that progress through technology, from the perspective of blacks, has always had a different meaning. And I guess that meaning is best symbolized in the invention of the cotton gin. A technological invention, from one perspective, would have alleviated human toil. But in the context of this country, where blacks North, South, East, and West are demeaned or considered less valuable, or they're not people who should be considered in any kind of alleviation of human suffering, are dismissed. The issue of technology with African Americans has always been mixed. And in the case of the cotton gin in the 1790s, because of the nature and the attitude of Americans and white Americans at the time, and slaveholders, in a different kind of world and a different time, that technological advance might have been designed and thought of as a means of alleviating human suffering. But since black lives were devalued or not considered valuable in any way other than as laborers, this cotton gin was simply used to further exploit the slave population. And it triggers among slaves, or the result, if there had been any question about what its fate would have been a further diminishing of the hopes of African Americans, free and slave, at the beginning of the nation, the earliest years of this country. It is the spur that causes a further expansion of the institution of slavery, and ultimately leads to a phenomenal domestic slave trade that had parallels in some interesting ways with the original Middle Passage. Because the lands that were opened in the South and Southwest, because of the expansion of cotton, spurred or created a situation where thousands and thousands of slaves are being torn from loved ones, from friends, from just the identity that they had with the land. I mean, as in any agrarian people, that there's a certain feel and experience with the land regardless of their status, and that these people are being shipped in part, at least part of their journey, by ship, shackled. One can imagine memories and parallels of the stories that they would have heard from the Middle Passage that they're experiencing again during this trip to another destination in oppression. Progress in this country, and progress based on technological innovations, whether these innovations are rooted in the cotton gin or the locomotive or whatever, for people who do not own themselves and have no power to take advantage, whether through travel or the building of any businesses, which was the case of slaves. All these technological innovations meant was new means to further exploit them. In the case of the railroads, the laying of tracks. In the case of ironworking factories, like Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond, many of the captains of industry or early technological innovators are inspired to buy whole groups of slaves to work these new gadgets and machines. I think that the issue in this country, one of the many immoral aspects of the growth of this country, has been a sanctity and a valuing of property in the hands of a few at whoever's expense, who was not privileged enough. The cotton gin provides an opportunity for more riches for the owners of property, the individuals who had access to the broadest amounts of land, and for a whole new group of whites aspiring in this country for the economic mobility and status of owning slaves. Here's an opportunity for them to get a piece of land. And with the cotton gin, it's going to be far more economical and feasible for them to amass some fortunes. For blacks, whether free or slave, because we cannot forget that even those blacks who had secured their freedom, it's a high probability that they had relatives remaining enslaved, and that this is simply one more means, this time technological, of further securing their shackles. And it leads to an aspect of slavery that always existed, the severance of family ties, the severance of ties of friendship, because to man and to woman, these new territories in the South and Southwest, there had to be this movement. And so just as with the cotton gin, so with the sale of human beings, what counted was the profit. What counted of how best and can I enrich myself, and that I, being a white slave owner who cares nothing more than to fulfill the American dream of richness and a material comfort, despite the fact that this is on the back of black men and women. A crucial aspect of Thomas Jefferson is revealed in his relationship and his correspondence with Eli Whitney. It is a correspondence and an interest with other things we know about Thomas Jefferson, captures very accurately what his primary concern is. And his primary concern is a way to continue his interest in consuming and acquiring every luxury and every item that provides some status available. In the cotton gin, I think his interest as a slave owner was hardly to find a way to perhaps free any of his slaves with some technological innovation. It is an interest in the kind of profit, I think, that he might have acquired from it. And I think, again, his concern and his interest in the cotton gin forces us, or it should force us, in my thinking, to think about Thomas Jefferson not in terms of words but deeds. He mutters occasionally thoughts about emancipation, but yet never liberates his slaves. He feels some discomfort with having his name in the paper or in the press associated with either runaway slaves or any aspect of slavery. But yet he's very committed to keeping those who allow him to travel and to build again and again Monticello. I don't think that Thomas Jefferson is a contradiction. I think that Americans who even ponder the issue of the founding father who speaks of inalienable rights as somehow not believing in those rights and those beliefs because of his slave ownership. He's not a contradiction because of his virulent racism, that he doesn't consider these blacks worthy of freedom. If we look at the kinds of comments he makes about them, both in terms of their odor, in terms of when we consider he's writing in the 18th century, about this belief in black men as having some particular desire, craving for white women. And in the same passage to talk about orangutans having a greater desire to have sex with African women than females of its own species. This is one of the most well-read men in the world at the time. So when he makes these arguments, he knows exactly what he's saying, and it reflects a hatred and a hostility that doesn't I think, in any way conflict with his other interests, and that is to make money, to be successful. I think that the most important thing we can learn from Thomas Jefferson about American history and the place of Africans and African Americans is that these dual realities in this country, a sanctity of property, and is in any capitalist society, this sense of one's possessions define one's value. Those possessions in the 18th century and the 19th century, in the case of ultimately millions of people, were human beings. And that sanctity on property was so important that it didn't matter that there are women and men and children who are being compelled to labor by the whip, who are being sold from their family members and loved ones. And if we don't consider the immorality of that particular emphasis on property, we lose an understanding of what this country was created. When he talks about the pursuit of happiness, that happiness was quite central in his thinking about happiness, was the ability to have this property in human beings. I think that the pursuit of happiness for slaves was the ability to gain their freedom. And I am sure that the slave who was in the company serving his master, Thomas Jefferson, as Thomas Jefferson was penning these eloquent words about freedom, was being informed once again, as countless other whites, that what they mean when they say freedom and what they mean when they talk about the pursuit of happiness clearly is something very, very different from what I, as a slave, and other people of color in this society believe and define as freedom and happiness. I think that the issue of how blacks read and understood ideas and beautiful phrases in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was very different, because blacks understood and recognized that a Thomas Jefferson who owned slaves, who has a slave serving him at every point of his life, when he goes off to college, when he goes to Philadelphia to the Constitutional Convention, that there's this major chasm between the two. I think that part of the understanding of slave rebels, and in this case specifically Gabriel, part of, I think, a culture of racism in this society argues that all ideas and principles of value and significance had to have come externally from African Americans. And so that there's a tendency to think that slave rebels somehow had to be spurred, whether by they were beaten particularly that hard that day, and that inspired them to lead a rebellion, or someone like Gabriel hearing the revolutionary rhetoric during the American Revolution somehow is where he got all of his ideas. The essential issue in understanding Gabriel and all rebels before and all rebels after is that people were willing and interested in taking any ideas and every idea, but that he, as other blacks, had their own ideas about freedom. And obviously, their ideas about freedom were very different from the people who were writing the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Well, because those writing the Declaration of Independence completely excluded black people. They did not consider, and not only black people, but women and whites who didn't have property. I think that Gabriel's revolutionary impulse came from multiple sources. He's following in the long line of blacks before him who advocated freedom and liberty for all. What happens in American society is that each time white people at each juncture in history seem to start talking about ideas of freedom or ideas that might help their own ideas, they grasp them. But to suggest that the only source of ideas were those that are coming from whites, I think further fuels that culture of racism that denies the body of ideas and thinking that blacks had themselves. I think that we must never forget that any kind of move toward liberation among blacks was a question of life and death. And so the kind of thinking and the seriousness with which any potential rebel had to take was incredibly important. And for someone such as Gabriel, who was literate, was going to be thinking about and reading and taking and listening and articulating whatever and everything he felt might be conducive to making people risk their lives. In addition to coming forth with the courage and with the enormous risk of plotting or even thinking about a rebellion, once that decision is made, there's the enormous logistical complication that the only time that slaves would have had any mobility without the most rigid observation of whites would have been on a Sunday, would have been at night. Religious gatherings could have, in some cases, provided an opportunity for people to meet. But the fact that there are all these things of where to meet, who to trust, how to plot and plan this to keep open lines of communication. In the case of Richmond and Gabriel, watermen on the James, in the same way as seamen, black seamen throughout the slavery period, often were the vehicles through which information about revolts or ideas that would encourage people to think about revolts. I think the risk for betrayal was very high. I mean, I would like to emphasize, or my belief, what strikes me most important and phenomenal in actuality is that there was so little collaboration generally throughout this period. But in the case of revolts, and it's understandable, is that this is a life and death prospect. And anyone becoming nervous, people would know that if they were charged as being a conspirator, could easily lose their life. And so the prospect of someone betraying was very high, and there became a tradition in the slave community that would have been passed through oral traditions that each succeeding rebel would have had a greater obstacle and challenge in recruiting people, because that oral history of betrayals was larger, longer, and would have given a greater sense of hopelessness about successfully bringing it off. But what's phenomenal about, say, Gabriel is how close it got. If the accounts and the inferences we can make about the numbers, that it lasted so long before any betrayal is quite extraordinary. I think that it's all tied in, well, I think there are connections between the sense of gaining their freedom through this betrayal. Sometimes there were monetary rewards. And we can't forget that in any kind of community of human beings, sometimes there are ties between particular owners and particular slaves that was close enough in some instances that that slave wanted to assure the safety of his or her owner. Wouldn't care about all other slaveholders being killed, but of course you can't have it both ways. I think Gabriel hoped to gain freedom not only for himself and the immediate area, but I think there was this perception that once securing the Richmond area, that there was the possibility of expanding. And I mean, we have to remember that these aren't wild-eyed fanatics, that they're thinking about the prospect of possible loss. And in the case of Gabriel, this belief that if they failed, that they would somehow be able to find their way to Haiti. I think the most successful thing about Gabriel in my thinking is that he came so close, but this, I don't know, inexplicable kind of thing in the history of humankind. I mean, the combination of the betrayal and this unbelievable thunderstorm. I guess, and I also have to say, I imagine there must have been slaves in the aftermath of this who felt, having come this close and with this storm, is there some force out there that's keeping us from ever really achieving our freedom? There must have been the kind of despair. I mean, from accounts that there had not been any storm in people's memory like this. And at that time period where people were much more connected with issues of spirituality and beliefs in the God, there are Africans who are involved in this, who have their own beliefs, that might have felt that this was some sign that perhaps they weren't destined for freedom. I think that Gabriel is an example, a very early example of a black person who's looking the world over for any other black people and people of color that could inspire this quest for freedom. And clearly, Gabriel is fired, electrified by the extraordinary achievement of Toussaint Louverture and the defeat of one of the most powerful armies in the world at the time. I think that the dream and the inspiration of a Gabriel is the same dream and inspiration of many other black people struggling for freedom in this land, was looking any and every place where other black oppressed people had struck out for freedom, and in this case, this wonderful case, succeeded. And that the success of Toussaint inspired every other black person struggling for freedom in this land until the abolition of the institution of slavery. I think that the issue of kidnapping in the North captures so many crucial aspects about the black experience in this country, that in a population that slavery had been abolished, and in a population that there was a critical, however small, but a critical number of non-blacks who declared themselves against the institution of slavery. What kidnappings revealed is that no place, even in a place of freedom, and even in a place where you had whites who were the most progressive from a black perspective, that they could be taken. So kidnappings reveal the challenge of free blacks every place, and kidnappings also reveal a very early example of social hierarchies and social divisions in the black community, in the sense that those blacks who were most economically secure also in many ways were best protected in regard to kidnappings, at least in regard to the people most susceptible to kidnapping, and the people most susceptible were children. And your most affluent blacks at the time had their children in private schools and under a kind of supervision that would have made it more difficult for kidnappers to take their children. I think that with kidnappings and this late 19th, early 19th century North would be just one more example of a repeating of a long tradition of an exploitation and a brutalization of Africans and their descendants. Because in the same way that Africans are being marched during the period of the transatlantic slave trade to the coast and the kind of suffering and beating and illnesses, these children and adults who are being kidnapped in the North and being marched to the South. And I can only imagine that the oral histories and traditions about Middle Passages, about these treks to the coast and being held in pens in another context, in another generation, in another century, are being repeated in this land of the free. I think that each glimmer of hope that African Americans have had in this country, something has happened seemingly to deter them from maintaining that faith. And for free blacks who are kidnapped, forced not only into bondage, but in this completely alien and strange environment, we can't help but assume that this is going to be another parallel with what the first Africans who are enslaved experience, being taken to a completely different area, completely alien to their culture and their reality. And if we think about someone such as Charles Ball, who is married, who has children, his first thought when he's captured, when he's taken, he makes the request that, can I at least see, well, his first thought is the issue of the futility of any resistance. And then his thought immediately goes to facing that quickly. This is a fait accompli. And he simply asks, can I see my family beforehand? And one of the things to me when I read this, it sends a chill down my back, that the response that he gets is, you can get another wife in Georgia. And so here's a man who's lost his freedom and is not even given the opportunity for one last communication, one last look, one last touch of the people that he loves so dearly. And in addition to this, finds himself in this completely alien environment. And were it not for a black worldview and a cultural dimension that Africans and their descendants create to incorporate people like Charles Ball, because in all of these southern and southwestern communities, you're having this constant infusion of people who've been traumatized by the loss of their freedom, traumatized by the loss of their loved ones. One of the most important propagandistic aspects of American society is the opportunity for security, for pursuit of happiness, for free blacks, despite the culture of racism and despite the limited opportunities for any kind of security or any kind of happiness for themselves, nonetheless did begin to have some ideas and some sense of freedom and security. With kidnappings, anyone who moved to another level of thinking, well, slavery is this horrible institution and there are these people there and I'll do whatever I can if they escape to help them. There was no doubt among some the possibility of distancing themselves from these people. Kidnappings would have brought a certain stark reality, any illusions that they may have been developing about their safety, their security, and their pursuit of happiness would have had to be, at bare minimum, reevaluated. I think that the ban on the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 would have provided for Africans and African Americans this yet another glimmer of hope about the abolition of the institution of slavery. There no doubt would have been some who would have been thinking in terms of, since there is this cotton gin, and since we see in the papers and we hear among whites this incredible happiness and joy of possibly themselves becoming slaveholders, that if indeed this happens, they're going to need laborers, and if they're not getting them from Africa, they're going to be getting them from the existing territories. And that probably gnawing suspicion or fear is in actuality what did in fact happen, that it triggers this enormous domestic slave trade where quite literally hundreds of thousands of blacks from the 1790s on are being forcefully marched another trek into a deeper and deeper white oppression. The choices and options of Africans and their descendants who are enslaved to preclude a sale or being forced to leave whatever environment that they were in, and all of their attachments of friendship and love were very limited. But every conceivable way of preventing it was attempted, whether that would be appealing to the master directly. And I think this is where you get the stark reality of slaves knowing exactly what they mean and cutting through any kind of language of appeals, of sentimentality, of going to this issue of the value of their labor. I mean, this is what the master cares about most. And when any such appeal, and this is only going to be very few slaves who would have even been able to have the ear of their owner. In a large plantation, the only slaves that would have had that access were slaves who worked in the big house, or slaves who had certain skilled positions that the owners would have had contact with them. On the other extreme would be the issue of mutilation. Their property, their being sold for their physical value and their capacity to work. They understood this. Hence, the first attempt being able to talk to the master and make an appeal about the greater value in keeping him or her. With that failing, there's the possibility of cutting off a foot, cutting off fingers. The sort of middle ground is somehow presenting themselves as not being sound, and you have a whole body of legal documentation of slaveholders taking another slaveholder to court because they were sold faulty property. Well, some slaves tried to convince their prospective owners that they were faulty, pretenses of insanity, incapacity to work, women making it clear that they could no longer have children because what masters were interested in was not only their productive labor, but their reproductive labor. There are many ways that people have described slavery, but I think the most important way of understanding bondage is how the slaves themselves perceived it. And from their actions, their words, their testimony, they clearly see this as an institution that by definition is a state of war. And I think for us to best appreciate and understand the dynamics of the relationships between masters and slaves is through that perennial conflict. A group of people determined to keep an entire population in bondage, and that very same population of enslaved people struggling to find their freedom. I think the slave master on a large plantation or a very small farm is the same. The greatest ambition for that man or that woman is profit, to enrich themselves on the backs of these laborers. On a very large plantation, the lifestyle that these wealthiest and most powerful enslavers was quite extravagant. And it was a relationship and a position that they would have had very little contact with the majority of slaves. The only slaves that they would have probably seen or known of or had any communication with would have been the domestic staff, some skilled laborers, and particularly the most important slave would have been the driver or the head man on that estate. I think whether a white child or a white adult, slave-holding adult, or even a non-slave-holding white, the presence or association or being anywhere in the environment of a slave-holding society, one would constantly be exposed to a particular kind of violence, of seeing people flogged, of witnessing particularly, which had a certain connotation sexually as well, when you consider that slaves, when they were whipped, were male or female, stripped to the waist. I think that with white children who are, even at that young age, slave owners, as their parents, as white non-slave holders in the community, there is an exposure inherent in any system of coerced labor, a certain violence. And so that the people in this situation are constantly exposed to the floggings of slaves. When we add to that the reality that when slaves were whipped, male or female, they were stripped to the waist, would have made it attractive and of greater interest to many people in that community. And the totality of that is to create a certain tendency toward violence, people expecting that they can get whatever they want. The sense of a certain imperiousness develops within that culture as a whole. And I think to understand the system of slavery, one's got to be very sensitive and aware of the violence that even slave children learn at that young age, that they can command a black adult, a black child, any black person to do whatever they desire for that person to do. White children learn even at that early age that they have the power to command any black person, whether a child their age, younger, or an adult, to follow their commands. And being in an environment that can demand that kind of imperiousness creates in the society as a whole, once these children grow up, even a more fierce kind of sense of themselves and what they deserve. On the Butler plantation, Joe, a slave, learns that he's about to be sold and separated from his wife, Psyche. His option, as countless slaves before him, were very limited. Could make an appeal. He, however, is particularly fortunate, at least, in being in a position that he would have access to the ear of the owner. on most large plantations, the number of slaves who would have had that opportunity was very, very limited. But outside of the appeal, what was one able to say? Ask, Master, please don't sell me. Short of that, and with knowing the character of a Pierce Butler, he immediately goes to the ultimate decision that would shape the thinking of an owner, and that is the complete loss of the property and any economic resources and profit that would come from them. And what he did was to threaten to kill himself. In this case, he succeeded in terms of preventing the master from selling him. I think that the number of slaves and the evidence, it's difficult to establish. It certainly happened, and there are accounts of it. I don't think this was widespread. I think at the earliest point of slavery and in the Middle Passage, and for those slaves in the colonial period, I think it was more common. But slaves did make that decision. The kind of devastation that people felt and trauma from being torn from loved ones, and particularly those individuals who perhaps had been sold before, reestablished another family, and then to find out that they would be sold again, the kind of despair that any kind of case of constantly being torn from loved ones could push someone to that point. I think one of the greatest weapons that slaveholders had was the threat of sale. And to prevent that sale, there were very few options on the part of the slaves. And since people were being sold for their labor and the profitability and what they could bring forth and the money that could be gotten for them, from the slave's perspective, accurately, the only way to deter that sale or to block the sale was maimings, the hoping to produce a legal crisis for the owner. That is, if all efforts beforehand prevented the sale from taking place, once sold could pretend to be crazy, or what we find in the legal documentation, not sound. And so there are these cases. Slaves did mutilate themselves, cutting off a hand, cutting off a foot, cutting off fingers, all recognizing that their sole function and the sole interest of their owner and any potential owner was their capacity to labor. And so they literally cut the essence of what they meant to their owners and their oppressors. We also know that slaves in another form of resistance was to kill themselves. Again, highlighting the core of what they meant to the people who owned them. I think in the case of Charles Ball coming across a runaway slave who had been beaten so horribly that Ball described him as having a whole different skin on his back, who hanged himself. Other slaves sometimes drowned themselves. The range of means by which they did so varied. One of the most important things to slaves was the ability to keep intact with their loved ones and family members. So any slave owned by someone who did not have an heir or heirs almost were assured of being separated in estate divisions. And so when the slaves of Fanny Kimball realize and see her children, there's a certain joy in knowing that the prospect, at least, of being able to remain intact was good. It's very revealing as well is that Kimball happened to be terribly observant and quite sensitive that many other whites, and I might even say most whites, when they saw slaves talking and showing an excitement about white slave children, their future owners, believed that this was simply a statement of these slaves' happiness and contentment with their bondage. But on the contrary, it was a revelation of something very, very different. Headman Frank captures a reality on a plantation that reveals why drivers who are assigned by the owner of the plantation to supervise the other slaves and to supervise with the symbol of authority and the most common spur to get slaves to labor, the whip. Why slaves respected, generally speaking, these drivers is because they knew that someone would be supervising them, and it would be better to have a black person who, despite this supervisory position, was still a slave, lived among other slaves, was no doubt married to a slave who would have had some advantages because of that relationship, but would also suffer. And in this case, he's married to a woman, Betty, who's raped by the overseer. And so the slaves would have had the empathy and the understanding that here's a man who understands the most wrenching aspect of bondage, and that is the sexual violence against women. And I think what's most revealing here in the case of driver Frank, as we see in other documents about the institution of slavery, is that had he physically resisted or taken any action against the overseer, most likely would have resulted in his death. And so slave men and slave women are always faced with this choice, this horrible choice, to resist and probably end up dead. There may have been a satisfaction in taking action against this immorality and this brutality, but the well-being and any opportunity that you could have played in protecting your children and helping to raise these children would have been, by definition, lost. I think that the rape of black women was not only pervasive, but it was so sanctioned in slave-holding societies that it's ignored in many ways. I mean, if we look at someone on any plantation at any point of slavery, there would have been mulattoes around. We know from the census in 1860 that 10% of the southern black population was classified as mulatto, and this was no doubt a very conservative estimate. So we're talking about 400,000 mulattoes. The overwhelming majority of these would have been the victims of rape. Both during slavery and after, the reality of the sexual violence against black women has generally been ignored or denied. Yet we know from the 1860 census that 10% of the southern black population was classified as mulatto. That's 400,000 mulattoes. The overwhelming majority are the victims and products of rape. And at the time of slavery, And just to give one example of the acceptance of this brutality is the work by one of the leading Southern intellectuals in a book published called The Morals of Slavery, Revealingly, in which the author argues that one of the great things, or the positive things about slavery, was that the virtue of white women was protected because young slaveholders could innocently have sexual relations or sow their oats, so to speak, with black women, and thereby spare the fragile and pure Southern women. The prevalence of a particular kind of violence that goes through the society, and the irrational and looking back at what could trigger violence is mind-boggling. And Charles Ball witnesses a house servant, as he finds out, who's being brutally lashed. She's tied, her legs and her arms are tied to the ground. She's stripped to the waist. The owner beats her brutally, and she's bleeding, and then he goes into the house and he brings back a candle. And he lights the candle, and he's dripping the wax on the wounds of this woman. And then he proceeds to lash her further. How heinous this particular whipping was made Ball particularly curious about just what exactly had she done. And when he goes up to the house and he talks to other slaves, he finds out that this house servant was a cook, and all she had done was burn the edges of waffles. And so that could not only trigger that kind of violence, but what he also found striking was that as she's being whipped, he looks at the house and he sees that the planter's daughters are looking out and watching this as well. So it's on any issue of the protection of the morality of the women within the society and their purity, all of these individuals are being exposed to this kind of violence. And not a few slave-holding women are notorious for their ability to use the lash themselves. It never ceases to amaze me the contrast between what slaves recorded about their experience and what their owners recorded in newspaper articles, novels, diaries about the institution of slavery and Southern white women. That this image of this very genteel and sensitive and polished individual is a major contrast with what slaves talked about, that so many of these women slaveholders were more brutal in their whipping. That it's not just their insisting upon and ordering the whipping of other slaves, but their personal involvement in devising all kinds of tortures for these slaves and whipping them themselves. And it's striking to me as well that very often slaves argued that the women were more brutal in their beating than their husbands and male slave owners. If the institution of slavery was indeed, as so many would like to believe, a patriarchal institution, then these slaveholding men were the most incestuous fathers in the history of humankind. In Savannah, Georgia in 1859, a sale that was so horrendous, it's still known as the Weeping Time, which captures so graphically the kind of personal remorse and torture psychologically for the people on the plantation in Savannah, Georgia in 1859 where over 400 people are sold at once. Appropriately, the sale takes place at a racetrack. And this association with simply as with horses, human beings are no different than these animals gathered to race for the entertainment of people. And the whole setting and the attitude of people looking at these bodies reinforced so graphically and indelibly in the thinking of these, anyone who was there, and certainly any of the, all of the slaves, that patriarchs purportedly loved their black families as they loved their white families and wanted to protect these families. Well, when you had all of these people being sold without regard to their familial bonds, simply highlights the travesty behind any of these metaphors of slavery as a paternalistic institution. I think that we can learn so much about this weeping time from the descriptions of the women and the men there, that the women, despite the fact that they had their bodies being touched, their mouths being forced open, being forced to move in various ways to test their effectiveness or their potential as laborers. Nevertheless, the descriptions of their dress and their headbands, that despite all of that, they were carrying themselves with a certain dignity that I think is so very revealing, is that you may own me. You may be able to force yourself on me sexually, but I'm going to perceive and carry myself in such a way that you can never penetrate. You can never take away this certain psychological aspect of me, this psyche, my spirit, my soul. I think it's very, very revealing that the way slaves described slave traders was to call them soul traders. And because they were efforts to take and destroy the very souls of these individuals. The brutality of slavery is revealed as well on another level in this weeping time sale in Savannah, that it also reveals how despite that horrendous brutality that we can see in how the women and the men are carrying themselves at this time, about their refusal to allow slave owners to take their dignity. They might be able to take their body, but in descriptions of how they hold themselves and the appearance that they maintain despite being forced to move a certain way, to open their mouths, that for these white men coming and touching the bodies and looking at these women in such a degrading and insulting way, that the descriptions of their turbans and the care which they've dressed the ones who have babies and infants, all capture in my thinking this sense of slaves as there's a part of us that your ownership and your sexual violation and anything else that you do to us that you cannot penetrate. We refuse, you simply cannot. Because one of the things that this institution attempted to do was to take the very sense of individuals as being able to one day be free or having any kind of hope or ambition. And I think that's why they called those who sold flesh and blood soul drivers. This is what they were attempting to do, not only to move property from place to place, but to further demean. Making sense of this nightmare of bondage was an enormous challenge. And a certain segment of the slave population found some sense in a Christianity that they took as their own and cast out the kinds of racist and pro-slavery interpretations of Christianity that white slaveholders tried to promote. If we look at Cooper London, who represented in his preachings some of the best aspects of that particular interpretation of Christianity, because here's someone who was not only a man of God, but a man who was willing to take enormous risk by teaching other slaves how to read. And so that slaves who were Christian, and a lot of slaves were not, were able to identify with him as here's someone who is not only speaking to us spiritually, but speaking to us in providing us with something that we consider almost as valuable as freedom. And by taking the chances that he did, not only established his credibility as being someone attached and committed to his fellow slaves, but his refusal to tell Fanny Kimball how he learned how to read further supported his clarity and understanding of how dangerous all white people were, however sensitive and kind that the power of their skin, and particularly their ownership, whether through marriage or not, made them potentially deadly. For any slave to teach another slave how to read, first of all, to reveal that he or she could read was very dangerous, so that there's a dual danger. The penalty that one would have in severe lashing. There are cases of people being mutilated once it was discovered that they were illiterate. It would be added punishment that someone not only had learned how to read, but was teaching others to do so. Cooper London's credibility and the respect that he would have gathered from other slaves was not only based on his role as religious leader, catering to their spiritual needs, but that he was himself putting himself at enormous risk by teaching them how to read. And also, his credibility was there about his understanding of the institution of slavery by his refusal to tell Fanny Kimball how he learned how to read and acknowledging it, because he understood the danger of all white people. And I think this is something that generation after generation of slave instilled, that these were powerful, dangerous people that one should keep as far away as possible. I think that it's because of the role of the lash and the belief by slaveholders that whether slaves had done anything, quote, wrong or not, occasionally they just needed to be whipped, that it's this symbolic core to represent the overwhelming power of whites and slave owners, and that everyone would have had to have seen it, would have heard it. For anything or nothing could be whipped. And this lash, as Charles Ball describes it so graphically, struck terror in slaves. And that people could be whipped 10 lashes to hundreds of lashes. It's when you read about and you see that an individual on these lashes that could be 7 feet in length, to get 100, 200, 300 lashes, and even when they would be broken down of X number of lashes today, tomorrow, can you imagine what someone's back would look like? And keep in mind that they're being stripped to the waist, women and men. I think to preserve some sense of wholeness and to create as a group this sense of resistance and this sense of, despite the odds against any freedom, that collectively this encouragement of a variety of acts of resistance. And I think among slaves, psychologically, there was a support and an encouragement and respect for people to do whatever they could do, however they could do it. Some people were going to take that ultimate chance and organize, or an equally dangerous action to run away, where you knew that there were dogs that slaveholders had trained that they called nigger dogs, that in some cases they, upon capturing a fugitive, had the dog bite them in the thinking that a dog that had tasted black flesh would be better capable and able to hunt down future fugitives. Those individuals who simply slowed down their labor, or women who used the excuse of female problems, whether they were actual or not, was a gendered kind of defense against the institution of slavery. However they could pull away some of the labor and some of the profit that these enslavers got from their labor was psychologically a means by which people felt there is a part of us that they will never get. What slavery means to me as a descendant of Africans who were enslaved in this land and who survived the Holocaust of almost unimaginable physical and emotional brutality, as well as what slavery means to this land, is, I think, best captured in an analogy that initially may sound jarring, but I think captures the essence of this legacy of the institution of slavery. And I think if we compare the response of the descendants of Nazis and the descendants of slaveholders, that there are certain similarities in the sense that neither the descendants of Nazis nor the descendants of slaveholders hold or should have any responsibility for what their ancestors did. But that in each case, both in terms of Nazi Germany and this genocidal effort to annihilate all Jews, and the response of slaveholders and their descendants in this country, on the one hand, in Germany, that there were trials, there were reparations, there is today still an uneasiness in talking about, or a recognition at least, of this horrendous crime that took place. But if we look at North America, on the contrary, the descendants of slaveholders have created oftentimes a mythology. Comments about what I remember, what I heard from my great-great-grandparent is that she or he, or that they collectively were very kind to their slaves. There's been no national apology or no governmental recognition of the cost that slavery entailed for the people of African descent in this land. And those analogies that whether or not a particular descendant of a Nazi personally was involved in any special or particular brutality, or whether the descendant of a slaveholder in this country personally was involved in a whipping or a particular brutality. In each case, they were part of a broader system that was responsible for extraordinary crimes against the people. And it's all fueled from the same culture of racism that argues that in the case of Jews, that simply their Jewishness, the fact that they are a particular people and a particular religion, and in the case of blacks, a hatred and a despising simply because they're not white, could lead to the kind of atrocity that we found in Nazi Germany. And that if we as a people, as Americans, don't acknowledge how at the very inception of this country was grounded and founded on a lie, on not the inalienable truth of equality, but on the contrary, a commitment to equality solely and exclusively for white men of property. If we don't face up to that truth, we will perpetuate the kinds of hostilities and irrational discomfort with people of color. And so I think we need to understand that slavery created certain hatreds, and the mythology surrounding the institution of slavery continues today to have that kind of negative impact. Well, I think that slavery was never simply an economic issue, and particularly after this creation of this concept of race came into being, that it became as important to exploit and to control this population for their coerced labor as it was to assure that this people, because of a racism, who were defined as somehow uncivilized, unworthy of being part of this broader nation, that they had to be controlled. And so what happens after the Civil War, already in place, were the kinds of mechanisms of control designed to keep free blacks beneath whites in the North, and the mechanisms in the South to keep free blacks beneath whites in the South. So that whatever differences existed, and obviously people fought a war, with thousands and thousands of people dead at the end of the Civil War. But the one thing that was held in common by these two purported enemies was their collective commitment to keeping Black Americans in terms of their social, economic, intellectual, political, cultural place beneath that of the majority of white people. I think it depends on whether you're a Black or white immigrant. If you're a Black immigrant, both in terms of the ease or rather lack of ease in gaining citizenship in this land, reveals that all the positive opportunities that you perceived you would be able to receive in this land, that your color was still going to be an added burden in addition to simply your not being a citizen. If you're a white immigrant, very early on, and we have accounts much later of before people can even learn the English language, learn nigger, learn in a multiplicity of ways that somehow an association with, an identification with, an affiliation with people of color detracted from your viability and your worth in this nation that you've emigrated to. And so the lesson that I think for all immigrants is the meaning and the power of a particular culture that no matter what, and I think this is the stark reality that Black people have had to contend with, and that is in the same way that slave parents had to decide and work out at what point do I tell my child the danger of white people. Black parents have had to somehow instill in their children and to try to assure some kind of dignity and some kind of sense of possibility to contend with what do you do? Is it, how do you tell a child, or how do you personally as a Black person face up to the reality that no matter what one does, that the stark, horrible truth is that one's discriminated and despised simply because, however irrationally, you're not white. And so I think what Black people have done over the years is to encourage children nevertheless to try to do whatever they can and to emphasize, perhaps getting an education or speaking a certain way or dressing a certain way. Not to learn the history of slavery will assure a continued ignorance, hatred, and tragedy.